Our next stimulus talks from the perspective of an ethicist. And we have a very particular argument being presented. We have Robert Gillett has argued that because this is our argument clearly, thorough knowledge of genetics would enable us to cure over 3,000 inherited disorders that affect humanity. Deciphering the human genetic code will certainly benefit humanity despite its enormous cost. So we're already told about a negative. So we have this genetic code thing, and we say deciphering is good. It would be a benefit. However, we're immediately told about cost, which is a negative. So to a degree, we should really be on the lookout for any other negatives that might be factored in, because we've already been given a little bit of a clue that there may be some negative to this logic or some issue with the logic. Gillett's argument is not persuasive, however. Well, there we go. There's some problem with the argument because he fails to consider that such knowledge might ultimately harm human beings more than it would benefit them. So this is a very typical pattern, which is a cost-benefit analysis. It's a pattern that repeats consistently, where if you're asked to consider a benefit or a benefit is presented, you must, without question, consider the cost, or the C. Right? So here we're told about the benefit, but there is no discussion of the cost. And the conclusion, or the end portion of our stimulus, really is bringing up the fact that there may be a cost, a very significant cost, i.e., there may be more harm than good. Let's go ahead and take a look at each of our answer choices in relation to our stem, which says which one of the following most accurately expresses the conclusion of the ethicist's argument. Well, the ethicist's argument is rather simple, that we are failing to consider some of the negatives that may arise. So let's look at A. A says Gillett's argument wrongly assumes that deciphering the genetic code will lead to cures for genetic disorders. Well, that doesn't seem to be challenged. So I think A is going to be out. B tells us deciphering the genetic code might ultimately harm human beings more than benefit them. Well, there's actually not too much wrong with that, right? Because we say deciphering the genetic code might ultimately harm human beings more than benefit them. It goes a little bit in the direction of what we were looking for. And however, that being said, take a look at our however statement, because however he fails to consider that such knowledge might ultimately harm human beings more than it would benefit them. So we're talking about the knowledge, right? And B is talking about deciphering the genetic code itself. So it's a little bit different. We're going in a slightly different direction. Let's put a question mark on B, because we're going to consider it a bit further. And let's keep going and look at C. Because of its possible negative consequences, genetic research should not be conducted. Well, we're not saying that we shouldn't do it. We're just saying that we must consider the negatives. So C would be out. D tells us Gillett's claim that a thorough knowledge of genetics would enable us to cure 3,000 disorders is overstated. We've never made that claim, nor was that contrarian position ever presented. E says Gillett's argument is unconvincing because it ignores certain possible consequences of genetic research. Okay, certain possible consequences of genetic research. That being said, there may be more harm than good. So we should be comparing B and E here. So E tells us Gillett's argument is unconvincing. So we're challenging the argument of Gillett itself, or himself, right? That's definitely better than B, which is just talking about the deciphering of the genetic code in general. And we're challenging Gillett's argument, which is the argument presented in our stimulus in E, And we explained that it's because it ignores certain possible consequences, i.e., the possible cost associated with this research. So E looks very attractive and like it's matching quite well. Let's go back to B and see if we can find anything else that's missing and or that's potentially off about it. B tells us again that deciphering the genetic code might ultimately harm human beings more than benefit them. Well, the deciphering itself isn't going to harm human beings on its face directly. What we're looking for is really the mere fact that there may be some possible consequences that aren't being considered, i.e., the cost is not being considered in our logic. So as a result, E should definitely be our correct answer choice.